go ahead and. Well, good evening. Sorry about that. All right, let's try that again. Good afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. And we are so glad to see everyone's face here. We're glad you're here. This is the second time we've done a parent Zoom, and we just love doing them because it gets us an opportunity to meet parents of all our administrators and faculty that we get to spend so much time with. So I want to say welcome to you. I want to introduce a few folks before we begin. I want to, Pat and Jeannie. Pat Blevins is our Director of Operations at SAES. If you'll wave your hand, Pat.
Hello, everyone.
And then we've got Jeannie Stark, our Director of Accreditation, who is here and with us. And we've got Andrew Wooden, who is our Interim Executive Director. And we're going to hear from him in just a minute. But we want to, I just want to say thank you for them being here. We just love having them. A couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Andrew and we introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. This is a Zoom call. It is being recorded and it will be available for 30 days after this. I think it's after biennial. Is it going to be available 30 days after biennial or 30 days after this, Pat?
30 days after this.
Okay, 30 days after this for any school that has registered. So we want you to know that. Tonight, we are going to be offering an opportunity. It's going to be about a 10-minute opportunity for Q&A. And so we want you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We also want you to know that the chat feature is going to be going the whole time. So feel free to throw things in the chat. I will be monitoring that Q&A box. We're going to do our very best to get some questions in. Obviously, we're going to have a lot of people on this call, so it may be that we don't get to your question. We hope we do, but just want you to know that that's really the best place to do that is if you can put your question really in the chat would be fine. Let's just do it in the chat because I'm going to be monitoring that the whole time. And so want to make one last shameless plug for our teachers and faculty and administrators on this call. David is going to be our keynote speaker at Biennial Conference, and our conference is virtual this year. He's going to be awesome. So we're going to get to see him twice, and I'm really excited about that. But I hope that you guys will join us for that Biennial Conference, that you'll register for that. And we're going to be sending out more and more opportunities for you to register. If you're a faculty member and you want to know more about that, feel free to reach out to us at SAES or reach out to your head of school. And if you are a head of school, we hope that you'll encourage your faculty and your admin staff to register because it's going to be a great conference. So I want to go ahead and turn that over to Andrew now and let him introduce David.
Thank you, Mary Catherine, and welcome to everyone. We're thrilled we have about 250 participants on this call this evening. And I am zooming in from St. Michael's Episcopal School in Tucson, Arizona, where a group of school leaders from SAES schools is doing a school accreditation. And David, I'm honored to introduce you now. David Epstein is the author of 2 top 10 New York Times bestsellers. The first one, Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and the second, The Sports Gene: Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. David was previously an investigative reporter at ProPublica, where his writing topics ranged from drug cartels to poor scientific practices. Before that, he was a senior writer at Sports Illustrated, where he wrote or co-wrote many of the magazine's most high-profile stories, including the revelation that Yankees third baseman Alex Rodriguez had used steroids. David's 2014 TED Talk on improvements in athletic performance has been viewed over 7.2 million times. Most importantly to our group, David has agreed to tailor this talk to SAES parents. And as you heard from Mary Catherine, that David will take questions, and his talk tonight will be different from the one he is giving at the biennial. So it's important to see if you can attend both. David, we're thrilled to have you tonight speaking to parents. Thank you for making it personal. And now that you are a parent yourself, you see this through a couple of lenses. I give you David Epstein.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I wish I could see you all in person, but I'm glad we're doing this and appreciate the flexibility and adaptability. And just so you know, I'm going to ask you to use that chat box at partway through this talk. There's going to be some interaction where the audience can direct some of the way that the talk is going to go. So identify that chat box. Maybe 20 minutes in or so, I'll ask you to participate a little bit. So, but I want to start to back up. I've been thinking about some of the topics I write about through the parenting lens, being a new-ish parent myself. And so I want to talk about some of the broader principles of human development. And I want to start with what I think has probably been the most impactful modern story of development. And it starts with this guy, Tiger Woods, right? His father famously gave him a putter when he was 7 months old. At 10 months, he started imitating his father's swing. At 2, you can go on YouTube and see him on national television showing off his swing. By 3, he was saying, I'm going to be the world's next great golfer, the next Jack Nicklaus. He's famous as a teenager. Fast forward to the age of 21, he's the greatest golfer in the world. It's that quintessential 10,000 hours story, right? Or what scientists call that the deliberate practice framework. Another that features in a number of best-selling books is that of the Polgar sisters. It's a little bit like a real-life Queen's Gambit in a way, where Laszlo Polgar, here he is with his 3 daughters, decided to teach them chess in a very hyper-specialized technical manner from an early age. And it wasn't because he cared about chess. It was because he wanted to show that with a head start in so-called deliberate practice, this is focused on error correction, coach technical practice, not playing around, that any child could become a genius in anything. And 2 of Laszlo's daughters, in fact, went on to become grandmaster chess players. So in my past life, I was training to be a scientist. When I got off that track and became the science writer at Sports Illustrated, I wanted to write about this work, the 10,000 hours work in my domain in sports. And so I figured that what we would see is that elite athletes get a head start in so-called deliberate practice, right? So I went and looked at the research. In fact, elite athletes do spend more time in deliberate practice than athletes who plateau at lower levels. But when scientists actually track the athletes over the course of their development, the pattern looks like this. One of those words faded away. This says near elite down here. The pattern looks like this. The future elites actually spend less time early on in deliberate practice in the sport in which they will become elite. They have what scientists call a sampling period, where they do a variety of activities. They learn broad general skills that scaffold later technical skills. They learn about their own interests and abilities, and they systematically delay specializing in just one thing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. So that did not comport with the most famous work in my area. And so I was a little surprised and started to wonder about other domains that we associate with obligatory early specialization. And the next one that came to mind was music. Now, this is data from a world-class music academy. And what I want to draw your attention to is this, that not until the 3rd instrument did the musicians deemed exceptional by their instructors start spending more time in that deliberate practice than students who were just deemed average, right? They too had a sampling period where they tried a variety of instruments. They spent a lot of time in sort of more playful activities that were self-directed. This was true even of very famous musicians like Yo-Yo Ma, who himself, he tried 2 different instruments first, didn't really like them, abandoned music for a while, and then came back when he found cello, and that really sort of lit his fire. So he too had that sampling period. He moved through it more rapidly than most people do, but he was afforded that same sampling period. But this research is almost entirely ignored, and much more impactful is the first page of the book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. It was excerpted in the Wall Street Journal as the paper's most commented upon article ever. And on that first page, the author promises the secret to raising successful children and talks about assigning her daughter violin and having her do 5-6 hours of deliberate practice a day. Now, everyone remembers that part, but nobody seems to remember the part later in the book where the author, to her credit, notes that her daughter later turns to her and says, "You picked it, not me," and quits, which is quite in line with what the research says would happen. But that part didn't seem to stick the same way. So again, seeing this kind of surprising pattern, In another domain, I started to wonder about domains that impact even a lot more people, like education. And I came across a study by an economist of the higher ed systems of England and Scotland. And in the period that this economist studied, the systems were really, really similar. The difference was in England, students had to pick a specialization in their kind of mid-teen years because they had to apply to a specific course of study. Whereas in Scotland, they could keep sampling if they wanted to, they didn't have to, all the way throughout university if they wanted to, they could keep trying things. And his question was, who wins the trade-offs, the early or the late specializers? And what he saw was that the early specializers, they do jump out to an income lead because they have more domain-specific skills. Not a huge surprise. The late specializers get to try more different things. They build a broader toolbox. And they end up, because they get to try things, they end up with higher, what economists call match quality, which is the degree of fit between one's interests and abilities and the work that one does. Turns out to be very important for your sense of fulfillment and your performance. And so because they had better match quality, their growth rates were faster. And by 6 years out, they flew past the early specializers in income. Meanwhile, the early specializers started quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers, essentially because they were made to choose so early that they more often made poor choices. So they were quitting even though they had more disincentive from doing so because they had already spent time in a specific area. So once again, the pattern was the late specializers get behind at first, but triumph in the long run. Seeing this pattern again got me interested in the developmental histories of people whose work I myself most admired, like Duke Ellington, in my own life, my sort of heroes, who shunned music lessons as a kid to focus on baseball and painting and drawing and only came back to music later. Mariam Mirzakhani, who dreamed of becoming a novelist, only to go on and instead become the first and so far only woman ever to win the Fields Medal, which is the most prestigious prize in the world in math. Or Vincent van Gogh, who had 5 different careers, each of which he deemed his true calling. He had an incredible work ethic. He would write home to his parents and always say, I will never have to look for work again. You'll never have to worry about me again. Before he flamed out spectacularly in each and every one of those 5 apparent vocations. Nearing the age of 30, he was kind of an itinerant preacher. He had no possessions, he had no achievements. And he picked up a book called The Guide to the ABCs of Drawing. It was written for 10-year-olds and just started drawing the world that he saw around him. And that was his first foray into art, nearing 30 years old. And that worked out okay. Claude Shannon, who was an electrical engineer at the University of Michigan, was forced to take a philosophy course to fulfill a requirement. And in it, he learned about a near century-old system of logic by which true and false statements could be coded with ones and zeros and solved like math problems. And then Claude did an internship at a phone company and realized he could use relay switches like those ones and zeros and code information into circuits. And that gave rise to binary code, upon which all of our digital devices today rely. And as Claude said, it just so happened that nobody was familiar with these 2 things at the same time. So again, this zigzaggy sort of path that at one point looked like him getting behind or taking his eye off the ball turned out to be a huge advantage. Or finally, this is my own sort of personal mentor and role model, Frances Hesselbein. This is me with her. Frances did a lot of volunteering in her community, but took her first professional job at the age of 54. And she went on to become the CEO of the Girl Scouts, which she saved. She tripled minority membership. She added 130,000 volunteers. Those are people she paid in a sense of mission, not in money. She turned the cookie business into $250 million a year that kept growing from there. And she changed the organization from one that was preparing girls for life at home to one that was preparing them for jobs in math and science. This is one of the badges that came out of her tenure. It's binary code for girls learning about computers. And Frances, by the way, now she's 105. She runs a leadership institute in Manhattan. As she says, who knows what's next? She's 103 and a half in this picture, by the way. So all these experiences that she did, what she said, I just do what's needed at the time, what's in front of me. Those all gave her this very unique skill set over the course of her career. But we never hear developmental stories like this. Even when the work or the individuals are really famous, we don't hear these stories the same way we hear the Tiger story. And for example, here's someone whose work I've followed for quite some time. Here he is at age 6, wearing a Scottish rugby kit. He played a variety of sports, from tennis, wrestling, skiing. Mother was a tennis coach, but declined to coach him because he wouldn't return balls normally. Right? Wasn't into deliberate practice. He tried table tennis, basketball, swimming. When his coaches wanted to move him up to play with older boys, he declined because he just wanted to talk about pro wrestling with his friends after practice. And he kept trying different sports: handball, volleyball, badminton, skateboarding, rugby, soccer. And he was not like Tiger Woods, focused on being the next great from an early age. In fact, when he became good enough to warrant an interview from a local reporter, the reporter asked him if he ever became a pro, what would he buy with his first hypothetical paycheck? And the boy said a Mercedes. And his mother was appalled that he had said that. So she asked the reporter if she could listen to the interview recording. And it turns out the boy had actually said mehr CDs in Swiss German. He just wanted more CDs, not a Mercedes. His mother was fine with that. So maybe with that hint, you can guess who this is. This is Roger Federer. Turned out okay. Didn't specialize until later than a lot of his peers. But that's the norm, right? Even tennis enthusiasts, he's every bit as famous as an adult as Tiger Woods. But even tennis enthusiasts usually don't know anything about his developmental story, even though the science says it's the norm. And the Tiger story is the exception. So why is that? Why don't we hear that story? Or I gave a talk about some of these principles once, and Serena Williams sat down in the second row and raised her hand to ask the first question. I'm like, oh my God, like no matter what the research says, if she stands up and says I'm an idiot, like it's going to be a bad day. And she raises her hand and says, I think my father was ahead of his time. He had us doing taekwondo and track and field and gymnastics and ballet. And to learn how to do an overhand serve, I learned how to throw a football, et cetera. And he took us off the traveling tour so that we could focus on school for a while without too much pressure, et cetera. I was a senior writer at Sports Illustrated, had never heard this story before. So why don't we hear these stories, even though they're the norm? I think it's partly because the Tiger story is so dramatic. As my running buddy, Malcolm Gladwell, says, he's like, when you go on YouTube and see him as a 2-year-old on national TV, it's like a human cat video. You know, you can't look away and you have to share it with all your friends. I think that's one reason. But I also think it's because it feels like this very tidy narrative, this head start narrative that we can extrapolate to anything that we want to be good at or that we want our children to be good at. And I think that's well-meaning. But I think it's also pretty mistaken, because it turns out golf turns out to be kind of in many ways a uniquely horrible model of almost everything else that humans want to learn. So golf is the epitome of what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called a kind learning environment. A kind learning environment is one in which next steps and goals are clear for you. Rules are clear and never change. Patterns repeat. Feedback is quick and accurate. Work next year will look like work last year. Unfortunately for our ability to extrapolate from the Polgar experiment, chess is also a very kind learning environment. The grandmaster's advantage is largely based on knowledge of occurring patterns. So you do have to start studying those before about age 12 if you want to become a grandmaster. That's a fact. But that's also kind of why it's relatively so easy to automate, because it's based on recurring patterns. So in most areas where that early kind of specialization in order to get a head start really works well, you may not want to be there much longer because those are the areas easiest to automate. On the other end of the spectrum are what Hogarth called wicked learning environments, where next steps and goals may not just be handed to you, where rules may change if there are rules at all. Patterns don't just repeat. Human behavior is involved. Feedback may be delayed or inaccurate. Work next year may not look like work last year. So which of these sounds like the world we're increasingly spending more of our time in? Now, both, for sure, both, but increasingly more and more of this. And our need to do what psychologists call transfer, to take our skills and knowledge and apply them in new places. Our need to think in an interdisciplinary way and keep track of connecting parts has actually fundamentally changed our perception. So when you look at this diagram, the central circle on the right probably looks larger to you because your brain is drawn to the relationship of the parts in the whole. Whereas someone who's not been immersed in modern work with its need for relational thinking and interdisciplinary thinking would see correctly, by the way, that the central circles are the same size. So here we are in this wicked work world. That's not a value judgment. It's a psychological term, meaning where we need this sort of broad ability to adapt to things. And the signs of this change show up everywhere, very prominently in schools. But I think it's very common now that I've starting to get to know other parents who have kids older than mine. For parents, it's common to say like, well, school was better in my day. And it turns out there's literally no measure by which students today don't have a better grasp of basic skills than their parents and grandparents. None. It's just school has gotten better. There's no question about it. But the challenge has gotten much, much harder. So this, for example, this question is from a proficiency test that sixth graders got in Massachusetts in 1980, kind of before we became an information economy, to reach a certain level of proficiency in sixth grade math, right? So this is a problem if you have a second to quick read it, where you just have to have distance equals rate times time memorized. That's it. Now I want to show you a problem that those same sixth graders, well, not those same sixth graders, that sixth graders going for the same exact level of proficiency got 30 years later. Now we're in this information and knowledge economy where people have to be adaptable thinkers. Same level of proficiency. This one, 1980, this next one, 2010, okay? Here it is. Paige, Rosie, and Cheryl each spent exactly $9 on the same snack bar. They all bought these various things. Here you have a multi-step problem. You have to show your work. You have to think abstractly. You have to use, system of equations. You have to turn words into numbers. This is a much more difficult problem, but these are the same levels of proficiency, 30 years apart, because we've entered a world that requires this more abstract, relational, adaptive thinking that you get from broad exposure to different types of problem solving, but that takes longer to develop. So it can feel like kids are getting behind in many cases. Right? But it turns out that the best long-term development often looks a little bit slow because it requires a gathering of different types of knowledge and a gathering of different types of skills, just like those future elite athletes do, a gathering of different type of perspectives, right? And that's true if we want to raise not just kids who do well in school, but informed citizens also. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the most famous research in the field of judgment and decision-making. Sorry, that came out before I wanted to put it right up. In this research, it was 20 years long research that asked people to make predictions about the future, about work trends, about political trends, about economic and technological trends, all these things. And it turned out that the worst forecasters were the most specialized experts. This was over 20 years, 83,000 different predictions. They had come to see the whole world through sort of people who spent their whole life studying one problem, came to see the whole world through sort of one lens or mental model, and they became non-adaptive thinkers. Here's sort of one branch of that research that I found kind of funny, which involved specialists from 22 of the world's largest banks making currency exchange predictions over the course of a decade. So here you can see from year 1 to year 2, the actual exchange rate goes up and it's outside the entire range of all 22 bank predictions, okay? So it's outside the entire range again, outside the entire range again, then changes directions, outside the entire range again, then it's in the range, but outside the entire range once again. Then they get lucky once a decade, won't get lucky again, outside the entire range, in the range by 1. The conclusion of this research was that these expert predictions were worthless because they were falling prey to certain cognitive biases that have these kinds of very narrow specialists always trying to fit. They're focused on minutia from the recent past, essentially. This doesn't mean there was nobody who did a good job, who had good judgment in seeing what was coming around the corner. There were people who did quite well. Sometimes they had areas of expertise, sometimes they didn't. More important than what they thought was how they thought. Right? They were perspective collectors. They didn't jump quickly to conclusions, right? As is the theme and everything I'm talking about, they kind of looked like they were behind or uncertain at first. But they would go around to specialists and collect facts, not opinions, and then they would synthesize that information. The researcher who led this work described them as having dragonfly eyes. Metaphorically, of course. Dragonfly's eyes are made of thousands of different lenses, each one of which takes a different picture, and those are then synthesized in the dragonfly's brain. And that was sort of how these people operated. They went and collected all this information. So they seemed like they were just sort of wishy-washy sometimes at first, but they were just collecting and synthesizing. Some of them in this research actually turned out to do so well that they ended up like spinning it off as a separate business, and they were written up in Time magazine for making incredibly accurate COVID predictions. So this kind of judgment, this ability to be a good judge of information, what's coming, involves this broad exposure and collection of perspectives. And again, things that often look like they may be like a waste of time, but really are some of the most important things that I think we can possibly do. Okay, so a theme of all of the research that I wrote about in Range and that I talked about tonight is that sometimes what you can do to get a head start, whether that's developing a sports skill, whether that's developing a musical skill, whether that's picking what to study, whatever it is, sometimes those things that seem like a good head start actually undermine the best longer-term development. And that's a very difficult thing to reconcile, I think, as a parent, to understand that the well-being of your kid, whether they're picking match quality for what they're going to study or work in, that somehow getting behind can actually help their long-term well-being, even aside from just not stressing about being behind in the first place. The thing is, some of these narratives are so powerful, right? What about Tiger? What about Mozart? Well, Mozart, which I think is probably the second most impactful story of development that people have in the back of their minds, and the cultural osmosis. Well, Tiger specialized early, no question about it. But even these stories, I think the way we tell them is a bit wrong. And so I want to tell you a little bit, tweak them maybe a little bit in your mind. So Tiger himself has said his father never once asked him to play golf. It was always him pestering his father to play. He said it's the child's desire to play that matters, not the parent's desire to have the child play. Mozart, right? There's this idea that his dad was driving him to practice and all these things. I went through letters from his childhood, and it's clear that his father was responding to him initially. So there's a letter, for example, where a musician comes over to the Mozart home and to play with the adults, and little Mozart says he wants to play too, he wants to play violin, and his father says, like, you haven't had any lessons, like, go away, you can't possibly play. And little Mozart starts crying and then starts playing the violin part for the adults, and his father's jaw kind of drops. And so in both of these cases, the parent was really responding to this very unusual display of interest and prowess by the child, and then facilitating lots of opportunity. It was not parent driven the way that these stories are told. And by the way, these stories only show up in a few domains like chess, like classical music, and like golf, because they are these kinder learning environments. So you may have heard of, maybe you've heard of the book Grit, or read of Angela Duckworth's work. Right. So it sounds like people often ask me, well, what about that? Right. Stick to what you're doing. Well, I want to share with you some quotes from Angela Duckworth's newsletter from the week that my book came out. This is from, she's the guru of grit. These are some quotes from a newsletter. If you type in Angela Duckworth Summers for Sampling. Butterflies don't come from smaller butterflies. They come from caterpillars. Our children are caterpillars. It's neither necessary nor healthy for them to be steered toward one career or another before they're ready to make that decision for themselves. So what does grit look like early in life? She says a child who decides she wants to be a doctor today, or tomorrow she'd like to build houses. A teenager who changes sporting activities, might want to try the newspaper, right? This is the guru of grit, telling you this is what grit looks like early in life. Angela goes on, before specialization comes sampling, right? The exploration of possibilities that really you can't know anything about until you try them. Angela says in this newsletter, it took her a decade of experimenting to find where she could apply her own grit, right? And I think this grit research has gotten so famous that whether you've heard about it by name or not, it's sort of crept into our cultural consciousness, this idea that you can never quit anything. Whereas the woman most associated with the work herself says you need this sampling period first, if you want to know, if you want to understand where you should be applying your grit. And just to get one other person I seem to disagree with out of the way, here's me and Malcolm Gladwell debating the 10,000 hour rule. This is on YouTube, by the way. If you look at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in 2019, I guess it was, it's on YouTube. And in the last few minutes, Malcolm says, I think I made that error. I conflated two separate things, large amounts of practice being necessary, which I think is true. But in the back of my mind, I thought that meant specialization, which I now realize is false. So I think from the well-being perspective, from the sense of fulfillment, from the skill and judgment development perspective, this need for sampling, which looks like it might just be slower development, is backed by a mountain of research. But I understand that it's very hard for us as parents to think that it's okay for a kid ever to get behind, even though the research says that development is nonlinear and that this zigzagging early actually sets one up for better success later. We are more, right? This is the path. This is the story that sticks in our head. Right? But the world isn't like that. It's like this. And so this is the way we need to develop to meet that world. And these stops or labels, I don't have much room for my head, are labeled because this is the part where I want you to use the chat box and you can direct some of where the talk's going to go. So I'm going to ask just a little trivia question and chime in the chat box with what you think is the answer. Not expecting you to get it right. But we'll reward courage. So one of the first people I see who chimes in will be allowed to pick where we go next. Okay. So here's the first trivia question. According to a LinkedIn analysis of 500,000 members, what do you think was the strongest predictor? And of course, this would be something that's in a LinkedIn profile. That's how they were analyzing members. What do you think is the strongest predictor of who would go on to become a future executive? So chime in with what you think in the chat. I'm not expecting you to get it right. I'll be impressed if someone does, but we're just rewarding courage here. Volunteering, early leadership, secondary degree, risk taker. Oh, I love these. Lived experience. Excellent, excellent. Grammar, grammar, that's really clever. I like that. Number of career changes, who's worked in different areas. These are great. These are great. Keep bringing them in, even as I'm going to let someone pick, because I think it's interesting for fellow attendees to see. But as I said, I'm going to reward initial courage. So Veronica Nunes. Let me give the answer first. The answer is the number of different job functions that someone had worked in. The number of different job functions was the strongest predictor of who would in the future become an executive. And I sort of contacted some executives at LinkedIn and argued that their own products might militate against people wanting to do that because they want a very linear, clean LinkedIn. But that's still coming out of their data. They felt they weren't so interested in my idea about that, but it's still popping out of their data. So Veronica, if you could type in thank you for being the first to chime in. I appreciate everyone who chimed in. If you can type in which of these stops, assuming you can read the labels, that you'd like to go to next, that's where we'll go. So Veronica will give you about another 10 or 15 seconds to pick one other than, fit or grit. Okay, great. All right, thank you, Veronica. We will stay with the grit topic. So as I just mentioned, Angela Duckworth and grit, I think, has been a very powerful bit of science for parents. And I want to give a quick refresher on that work. So grit is the colloquial meaning is obvious, but the psychological construct is based on a 12-question survey. Half the points are awarded for persistence of effort, perseverance. The other half of the points are awarded for consistency of interests. So not changing what you're interested in. And the work became really famous with research done at West Point at the US Military Academy, where the grit survey turned out to be a better predictor of who would get through what's called beast barracks, which is the rigorous physical and emotional orientation that new students go through. So the grit survey was a better predictor of who would get through beast barracks than were more traditional measures like standardized test scores, a test of athleticism, things like that. So that's great to know. That's important. The grit survey also had some predictive value for who would graduate from West Point, as did those more traditional measures. But it's useful to have additional predictive value. And of course, cadets who go through West Point are fully funded, so they have a 5-year active duty service commitment when they graduate. And the point of West Point is not to create beast survivors or even graduates. The point is to create the future leaders of the organization, in this case, the future leaders of the US Army. And in that regard, things haven't been going as well with these very gritty cadets. This is what the retention curve looks like. Starting in about the mid-1990s, it started looking like this, where about half of those very gritty cadets start quitting almost on the day that they're allowed. And this trend popped up, virtually overnight in the 1990s. And so this caused sort of a crisis for Army leadership. And in reading through some of their papers, their white papers, they said, well, maybe we've developed a millennial grit problem, like too much avocado toast, not enough mortgages, or whatever the latest stereotype is of millennials. One high-ranking officer even said, we should defund West Point. It's taking it too easy on those millennials. Called it an institution that taught its cadets to get out of the Army. Pretty extreme judgment, I think. Then a group of officers who were also scientists decided to study the problem. And what they found was that, surprise, surprise, West Point had not developed a grit problem overnight. Cadets score very highly on the grit survey. They had developed a match quality problem. Remember, that's the term that economists use to describe the degree of fit between one's interests, one's abilities, and the work that one does. Turns out to be extremely important for your sense of well-being, that sense of fit. And so what these scientists and Army officers found was that the Army had this traditional upper-out career structure, right, which worked quite well when most of the rest of the economy was that way, where we were in kinder learning environments, where work next year looked like work last year, where you could have a discrete period of training or education followed by a lifetime of working based on just that training or education. And And because people tended to face the same problems more repeatedly, specialization made a ton of sense and lateral mobility was very limited. But then we enter the knowledge economy or the information economy or creativity economy, whatever you want to call it. And suddenly we prize people who can engage in knowledge creation, adaptive thinking, creative thinking, and people who can do that have enormous lateral mobility. And so these young people who were being identified as high potential were learning things about themselves in their late teens and early 20s and realizing they had no agency over career matching to try to respond to that information within the Army. So they would quit. So they would leave and do it elsewhere. Right? When first the Army thought it was a money problem, so they gave through bonuses at cadets, at future officers. Those who were going to stay took the money. Those who were going to leave left anyway. It was $500 million of taxpayer money. Didn't change retention 0.1%. Total could have taken that money to the track and lost it faster. So then once they started doing this research and realized they actually had a match quality problem, they started programs like one called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, oh, here's your career track, get up or out, they would pair the cadets with like a coach-like mentor and say, sample this one career, dip your toe into this one career area, reflect on how it fits you, keep track of those reflections in an online portal, very important for that reflection to be active. Talk with your coach about how it fits you, try another, and then at least 2 others, try at least 5, and triangulate a better fit. Keep reflecting as you go. As the researchers that followed cadets doing this found that some of them were surprised by things they thought they'd be good at that they turned out not to be good at. It's a disappointing surprise, but important to know. Many of them were surprised by things they thought that would be boring that they found to be very interesting. Pleasant surprise. They were often also surprised by things they thought they wouldn't be good at that once they got a chance to try, they were indeed good at. 90% of cadets who went through talent-based branching changed their career preference. 90% by being afforded that developmental period where, in many ways, talent-based branching is informed quitting, but they branded it much better as talent-based branching, right? That was the genius of this, where they were given this chance to see, to understand a little bit more of what's out there. And while doing that, to understand a bit more about themselves and to triangulate better match quality. Again, very important for both performance and sense of fulfillment. And this improved retention where money bonuses hadn't. And as one of the researchers who was doing this work described it to me, he gave me this phrase that stuck in my head. When you get fit, it looks like grit. Meaning grit is what psychologists call a state, not a trait. A trait is a quality about someone that pervades anything they do, no matter what they're doing. A state is a function of someone in a given context. It may be a stable function of that person, but in a given context. So it turns out that there are different states we can all be put in where we look very gritty in some and not so gritty in others. So when you get people in situations that fit them better, they will display the characteristics of grit, such as perseverance, retention, even if they didn't before. And so I think we need to keep this model in mind when we think about developing people to both be fulfilled and to be the best they can be, is that if we don't allow some of this time for sampling and reflection, then the chances that you'll get someone to good match quality are just that much lower. And I understand, I feel this acutely as a parent myself, that this means they will look behind at a certain point. But I believe this research that has been replicated over and over and over in many different ways in industries that shows this developmental period that allows people to triangulate better match quality makes for happier and higher performing individuals. Okay, so I want to go back to a new question here. So the next trivia question, since we're on the topic of Head Starts here, according to a research last year that was done by MIT and Northwestern University and the US Census Bureau, what do you think is the average age of a founder of a fast-growing tech startup on the day of founding? So again, put answers in the chat. Oh, these ones are coming in fast. 17, 38, 23, 44. Oh, we've got a great a mix here. Oh, Andrew chimed in first, but I'm not going to record. I'm not going to reward his courage. All right, great. We've got a good mix. It's all over the board. We've got I think the range looks like it was from 17 to 44 so far. We've got several 19s, some 30s. Okay, so the range is 17 to 44, number of 19s, some early 20s, a few 30s. I'm going to give Hunter Merritt was the closest. The answer is 45. The answer is 45. And a 50-year-old is way more likely to start a fast-growing tech startup than a 30-year-old. So Hunter, since you were quite close, guessing 44, again, we only tend to hear like the Mark Zuckerberg stories, right? Who dropped out of college and founded a fast-growing startup. And he famously said, young people are just smarter, right? He was 22 when he said that. You don't hear him saying that anymore, right? It behooved him to say that at the time. But again, just like Tiger Woods, we only hear those stories. Not that those stories aren't true in some way, but we focus on the exception, not what the science says is the norm. So Hunter, if you could pick which stop we're going to next, give you about 30 seconds to name the next stop. Congrats, Hunter. You have so much power. Use it wisely. Conceptual to procedural. I think, Hunter, unless I mislabeled one of my stops or you're seeing a different label, I'm not sure which one you picked. If you see the labels on your screen, I can, unless I'm missing something, did I rename one? I don't think so. If you see the labels on your screen, if you can pick from one of those ones that are up there, if you want to give another shot. I understand it's possible you're listening and don't see that screen, but if you do, if you want to pick one of the labels that's on the screen, give another try. I'm trying to just make sure that I didn't relabel one conceptual procedural and I'm missing. Space to try. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that if I did anything confusing. Okay, so there is a concept I want to start with that has to do with space to try. Oh, didn't leave enough room for my head, called the Overton window. Okay, the Overton window is this concept that means the window of things that will enter a discussion, basically. So status quo, right? Well, always, you have a meeting at work, status quo topics, and then popular topics will tend to enter the window of discussion. Now, politicians know, very strongly that if you want to move the Overton window, like you want to move the window of what people discuss, what you do is you say something like unthinkable, and the people won't adopt the unthinkable, but it'll move the window in that direction, basically. And this turns out to be like very important in organizational meetings, where when a leader speaks first, they set the Overton window. And so whatever they talk about is going to set that Overton window. So if you want people to be more sort of creative and flexible, they have to set that Overton window far out. And it turns out there's research showing similar findings in kids and developing creativity, that they will react very strongly to kind of the parameters that someone sets when they're in an area. So in school, it's difficult, right? Because we're dealing with a lot of people. You have to have sort of some standard methods. But I think it behooves us also to set aside spaces where we shift the Overton window over, and kids know that it's sort of a free time to be creative and to try things. And some of I think, oops, sorry, that came up a little early. So I want to give an example of a scientist who, my son's name is Andre, and that name is in honor of sort of my favorite scientist, a scientist named Andre Geim. And I want to show you a video of something that came out of some of his work. So let's see if this video works. I haven't actually tried this on Prezi Video before. It is working. All right. It's that's a levitating frog. So it's being levitated with strong electromagnets. So frogs in the water they contain are diamagnetic or repelled by magnetic fields. And this is work that Geim did to show that he could levitate frogs with strong magnets. And this work won what's called the Ig Nobel Prize. It's given every year for the year's silliest, most frivolous work. And the prize, instead of a Nobel medal, is a statue of Rodin's The Thinker, but it has fallen off its pedestal and it's lying on the ground. Okay. And they actually ask the person the recipient, if they're willing to receive it before they take it, because there might be concerns about reputational damage. Geim accepted it happily. He said, this kind of experimentation is where breakthroughs come from if you look at the history of creativity. And so this levitating the frog was part of what Geim calls at his lab Friday night experiments, where everyone on Friday night has to forget the things they do during the rest of the week. They have to forget the rigid protocols. They have to do things that are unfunded, that are just pure curious exploration. And the fact that it's a designated time, everyone kind of has to do it, and they're released from the strictures of the rest of the week. And so the levitating frog came out of one of the Friday night experiments. Another Friday night experiment started with ripping thin strips of pencil lead with Scotch tape. And that seemingly frivolous Friday night experiment led to the development of the world's first single atom thick material called graphene, which is stronger than steel, tougher than the Kevlar and bulletproof vests. It's more transparent than glass, electrically conductive. And for that, Geim won the Nobel Prize. So Geim won the Ig Nobel and the Nobel for these unfunded Friday night experiments where he just went off and followed his curiosity. As he liked to say, he switches areas. He's so curious, he switches areas that he researches constantly. He said, I like to say I don't do research. I only do search. And he says it's psychologically unsettling to be moving into new areas all the time and to not know what it is I'm going to find. But that's the way that breakthroughs happen. That's the way that creativity happens. Another Nobel laureate I spent some time with, I'll explain this acronym, was named Oliver Smithies. He had Saturday morning experiments where when I was interviewing him, I was going through his notebooks and noticing that all of his breakthroughs came on these Saturday mornings when, again, nobody was around in the lab and he was doing unfunded things. He told me, he said, yeah, people said, why did you come into work any other day? And Smithies he was so curious. He just wanted to play with the equipment of his colleagues. So before they would throw out old equipment, they would leave it with this label on it, NBGBOKFO, which means no bloody good, but okay for Oliver. And I tell these stories because not because we have to, not most people aren't going to be Nobel Prize, but the Nobel announcements are coming up in about a week, but most people, even most eminent scientists, aren't going to win Nobel Prizes. But these are actually emblematic of a huge body of research that suggests we really should have some set aside time. Now that we're in this kind of creativity world where creativity is really rewarded quite highly, I would argue far more than ever before in history, we need to set aside these spaces where the Overton window is shifted, where what kids think is okay is kind of shifted toward the weird so they can experiment. There's a final example that I want to give from sports of the impactfulness of just setting aside a time for this kind of experimentation, which again, I understand as a parent, it seems frivolous. It seems like you're not getting stuff done. This is the sport of skeleton, which you may see when the Winter Olympics roll around. It's like someone runs face first and they do like the disco move, the worm onto a sled and go down an icy track. And there was a Canadian coach I spent some time with. He was training at a track one day for the Olympics, and the American team came in and they had all this fancy equipment. And he looked at it and kind of freaked out and said, oh my gosh, like we can't compete with them for technology. We need something else. And he went to his two athletes at the time and said, we can't compete with that. Go in the start house, which is like a dry land area where you can practice starts, and just come up with something new. Like we need some advantage that isn't spending money in technology. And so at the time, everyone started like this with two hands on the sled. And the guys went into the start house. They came out 2 hours later and said, Coach, is it legal to start with one hand on the sled like a sprinter? The coach said, well, yeah, there's no prohibition against it. Just nobody had ever done it. Everyone had just done it the same way. So they did that and were breaking the start world records that day. Started blowing the world away, right? This was a very short-lived competitive advantage because then everybody had to start doing it, of course, once they saw it. But it was these guys who'd been training for about 7 years each in this discipline. 2 hours of being told, get in there and try something different, caused them to completely upend their domain. And so I think, again, we just need to keep in mind, if we want to develop the kind of thinking and creativity that's both fun and important, we have to set aside these spaces for Friday night experiments or Saturday morning experiments that seem a little frivolous. If there's one theme that I want you to sort of conceptually take away from what I'm talking about tonight, it's that sometimes the things you can do that cause apparent head starts actually undermine long-term development, whether that's developing a sports skill, picking what you want to study, matching with a career, or trying to harness creativity. And so I think as parents, we need to be sort of attuned to the fact that the development of the well-being and cognitive skills of our children, what seems the best in the short term isn't always the best in the long term. Now, I think a happy message from that is that you shouldn't worry so much about being behind. For me, the research that went into my book Range has made me, on the one hand, a little bit like, gosh, so I can't just engineer my kids' success in the way that maybe I wanted. On the other hand, it's felt extremely liberating because the research suggests that I don't have to worry every moment about him falling behind, because that's not how long-term development works. So I think we can look at both ends of this. I wouldn't worry so much about being behind, not only for your kids, but for everyone, right? Development is nonlinear. Our intuition is to see two people that are separated by a certain amount and assume that that's a stable trajectory and they'll always be separated by that amount. But that's not how development works. So we shouldn't spend so much time and energy worrying about being behind. So now I think we have some time for questions, but I want to leave just for a second up these other stops here, because if a question is just, hey, I really want to see what's under that topic, for example, then I'm happy to bring these slides that are hovering in the air back up, and we can turn over another of those topics. But I also want to leave time for questions. And if questions, if they haven't already come in, maybe I should address, Don mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned that there's a study at the Air Force Academy that was kind of my favorite that went into the book. And so I'll just describe that because I mentioned it when people were sort of rolling in. So start entering your questions for a sec now, and then hopefully we'll have some by the time I finish describing this. In that particular study, it was a study that only could have been done at a place like the US Air Force Academy, where about 1,000 students come in every year, and they are randomized to a sequence, to a calculus, to math professor. They have to take a 3-course sequence, and they are randomized to a professor, and then they are re-randomized for year 2 and re-randomized for year 3. So this incredible experimental environment. And the scientists doing the work there wanted to see, well, what makes a good teacher, right? Which teachers are the best for teaching math? We have this great natural experiment. And basically, long story short, it turned out that the teachers who were the best, and everyone takes the same tests, the teachers who were the best at getting their first years to score highly on the first year exam, those students then went on to underperform in the subsequent courses. So it turned out that what happened was that the students rated teachers really highly if they scored well on their exam in the first year, but those students then went on to underperform. And it turned out that the teachers that sort of taught a more narrow body of knowledge to the test gave those kids an important head start that helped them do well on the first year exam, but didn't set them up for future success. So the professors whose students did the best in the long run, those professors often were rated a little more harshly by students because the students didn't do as well on the first year test, but they gave them this broad base that served them in subsequent years. So again, there was this tension between teaching to the test in the short term, what looked good in the short term, and what was the best for long-term development. And that study just kind of blew me away, especially the fact that there's almost an inverse correlation between the way that the students rated their professors and how well they ended up doing in the long run. So I think now if we have a couple questions, I'm happy to take them, or to turn over some more of those cards if that's what.
Yeah, so we do have some questions. The first one is, how does this topic factor into colleges only accepting the top 6%, and in 14 years it could be even less? So kind of speak to the whole, at least in Texas, we have that rule. I don't know about other states, but that.
What's the specific rule in Texas?
Well, it depends. Some schools are top 10%, some public schools, the University of Texas is at 6%, maybe even less at this point. I'm not sure, but it makes it super competitive, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about other states, but we're seeing, this acceptance rate is difficult.
It's difficult, I think, if you have your heart set on certain colleges, right? Yeah. I went to a highly selective college, and from having read a lot of research in this area, I can tell you that the difference in impact that different colleges make is nothing like the public perception. Nothing. Right? There's a huge diversity of colleges in this country, some of which accept nearly everyone who applies, some of which accept almost no one who applies. And I think the research suggests that the gains that someone makes from that educational experience has a lot more to do with specifically the experiences they're having than with the selectivity of that college, than with, even the financial resources of that college, that the value add is, the colleges, the selective colleges would like you to believe that they're so selective because they have a higher value add, but that is not what the research suggests. And so I think we should be cognizant of the fact that there's a huge diversity of colleges. The difficulty for parents is that, we're kind of like part of the cogs in this enormous marketing machine where the colleges are competing for reputation and competing for customers. And there's a really good book out maybe 2 years ago by, let me just see if I can grab it off my shelf really quick so I can hold it
Okay.
up. It might be right behind me. Yeah. Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions by Jeff Salingo. And if you read this, you will, I blurbed it, of course, but because I thought it was excellent, you'll realize how little some of he's in this, the author is embedded with college admissions groups from sort of 3 different selectivity tiers of colleges. And you realize that the whole history of the admissions process is one of marketing. Basically, when someone who was an expert in political mailings decided to get into the higher education business, and that so much of what's going on really doesn't have anything to do with the well-being of the students, unfortunately. I mean, a lot does on campus, but in terms of the admissions mania. And so I think we should broaden our perspective and think more in terms of that match quality, right? Of what environment might allow a student to blossom. And that doesn't have anything to do with how selective that college happens to be, right? There's all sorts of things that colleges do to make themselves look more selective, even though most of those things don't change the educational experience or even really change the student body in a lot of cases, their characteristics. So I think we should broaden our search and realize that there are an enormous number of colleges, and we're usually only hearing about this very small number of very selective ones. Take a much broader view of this.
Thank you.
because
That's
most of what we
great.
think is marketing.
That's a great answer. Okay, so has any research correlated liberal arts degrees with career satisfaction?
Yes, I think that work in that area is, yes, it has. I think the work in that area is not necessarily the most rigorous. I think it's suggestive. I think there is work, there's more rigorous work. Well, first of all, there's work that shows that liberal arts in the long run, actually liberal arts students tend to out earn even like engineering students. So there was really interesting research I just added to the afterword of the paperback version of my book that looked at a dozen countries, matched people for their parents' years of education, their own years of education, and their national test scores. The difference was, did they get more career-focused education, or did they get a broader general education first? And the pattern was similar to what I mentioned between England and Scotland, where those who got the more narrowly tailored education they're hired more quickly, jump out to an income lead, end up less flexible in this changing work world. And so they win in the short term and lose in the long run because their growth rates are lower. They end up quitting more often. If their field is disrupted, they end up out of work more often, things like that. So there are performance benefits. I think the broader concept, whether it's a liberal arts education technically or not, I think there is work that shows this is ability that our insight into ourselves is constrained by our roster of previous experiences. And that includes what we've been exposed to in our studies. And that when you can broaden that, the biggest benefit, and the person who kicked off this research was a Nobel laureate in economics named Theodore Schultz, who said, we've done a great job learning how education adds skills to people and a poor job of learning what the value is about what it teaches us about ourselves. And so following up on his comments, some of his colleagues studied this and found that the return on investment to education, especially higher education, was greater in terms of what it teaches the person about their strengths and weaknesses and interests than about even the specific skills they learn. And that has a huge effect on fulfillment, your ability to do what's called self-regulatory learning, get experiences that help you reflect on your own strengths and weaknesses and continually and interests and move toward those. And so I think there's a lot of work that while I'm less convinced of this meaning that you need specifically a liberal arts education, that broadening the education in general helps people do this kind of triangulation that is the key to ultimate fulfillment.
Okay, that's great. This question is about feedback. You touched on it in a bit in the section on kind learning. Is it more helpful to give direct feedback or more of the asking questions approach?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. One, there's an interesting, Robin Hogarth is the psychologist that coined those terms. He has two books, one called Educating Intuition, that's sort of written for an academic audience. That's about how to try to set up feedback mechanisms that are helpful. And he has a newer one called The Myth of Experience. That's just sort of an interesting read. I think some of both, right? I think the best thing is if you can set up environments that naturally give people some feedback. That's super easy in sports, right? It's like you shoot a free throw and it goes too far to the right, and so you adjust back to the left. It's a lot harder in other areas of life. But in some of this work on so-called self-regulatory learning, which is how people incorporate feedback into what they should do next, it suggests that things like giving kids a test and then waiting 2 weeks to give them the results is really not a great strategy. And things like giving people annual reviews might be useful for if you have to tell them like that they might get fired, but not actually useful for their performance improvement. You need to have much less time between what they're doing and giving those results. So self-regulatory learners take a test, and the best would be is if the answers could be gone over very quickly, like in front of them. And so I think kind of setting up testing grounds. It's like we think of test is like such this derogatory term, but there's a huge body of research showing that testing in its various forms is a wonderful learning mechanism. You should actually be testing people before they're ready for the test, right? We don't like that because like kids, nobody likes to feel unprepared, but that testing is a great way for people to get feedback where it's kind of built into the system. So I think giving quick feedback is a good thing, but ultimately you also want to cultivate people who have those self-reflective practices, right? You should be proactive. Reflection is like the key word in self-regulatory learning. Whatever your kids are doing, they should be stopping and trying to get the most amount of learning about themselves out of it that they can. What met my expectations? What was I interested in that surprised me? What was I good or bad at that surprised me, etc. So a simple way to set up some of that feedback is by coaching those self-reflective practices and kind of setting up tests without the pressure that have kind of built-in quick feedback. But I also highly recommend that book, Educating Intuition, if you want to really take a deep dive on setting up useful feedback mechanisms.
So last question for you, and this is a great one. Can too much sampling become an issue? Too many activities? What's the tipping point for sampling?
Definitely. I think that's, one of the reasons I like to make sure I talk about grit is not only because I think Angela Duckworth is perceived as, being never quit anything, but also has a much more nuanced view, but also because I think it's important. I don't want to say you should just like pinball around and, never find anything, right? Because that can be a big problem itself. And I think there's no magic number of things that someone can do. I think the important thing is to make sure that your pivots are meaningful and based on what you've been learning. So there's some work I write about in the book done at Harvard called the Dark Horse Project. And this was work where it looked at people who were successful in their career, really looked at people who were satisfied in their careers. The dependent variable in this work was sense of fulfillment that people had with their work. Many of them were very financially successful, but not all of them, but they were all very fulfilled and had this great sense of well-being and worth in their work and of good fit. And the reason it's called the Dark Horse Project is because the large majority of people who came in for this research would say, well, I did this one thing and I didn't really like it. So I went to this other thing, but that wasn't a fit. So then I quit and went this other direction. And, then I just lucked upon my thing that was a great fit. And don't tell people to do what I did because, I came out of nowhere. It's called the Dark Horse Project because the vast majority of people who were deeply fulfilled felt that they came out of nowhere, that they were one-offs, when in fact that was the norm. There were people, I should say, who did follow the linear track. They were just the small minority. Again, they were just the exception. And the approach, the habit of mind that these dark horses had was they wouldn't look around and say, here's who's younger than me and has more than me. They would say, here's who I am right now. Here's what I know about my interests and abilities. Here are the opportunities in front of me. I'm going to try this one. And maybe a year from now, I'll switch because I will have learned something about myself. And they just keep doing that process of triangulation until they arrive at a place where they feel very deeply fulfilled. And they are very natural, proactive self-reflectors. Most of them kept like self-reflection journals where they would, which I got to see some of them, and they would ask questions like, what am I trying to do? Why do I want to do it? Am I sure I want to do it? Who do I need to help me do it? What do I need to learn? They were very proactive reflectors. So I see my role as a parent. It's sort of similar to that coach in the talent-based branching process that I talked about. You set up these options for your kid. They're always going to be limited, right? It's always a limited roster of things you can expose your kid to. And then my role is to help him get the highest amount of learning and signal about himself and his own interests and abilities from each one of those experiences so that his next pivot is as informed as possible. And then I think that's a process of triangulation through your life, right? Because both you and the work world change quite rapidly. So I think fostering that habit of mind and helping kids especially realize what they've learned about themselves and react to that knowledge is sort of the approach to take, because there's no magic number that I know of this is how many things there should be sampled.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice, especially when you've got kids in elementary school that want to try a million things, right? I love it. Well, David, thank you so much. We're at the top of the hour and a little beyond, and I just want to say thank you for answering our questions. And what a great thing. This was awesome tonight. And we're so grateful for having the opportunity to hear from you. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you again at Biennial. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who joined us. And we're going to stop the recording and hang around for just a minute